Hello, this is my 2014 reading stats video. I'm also going to talk about my 5 favourite books that I read this year. The Android's Conundrum made a video like this and I just immediately had to go off and make one for myself because who doesn't love data? Who doesn't love graphs and charts and stuff? First, I just have some general numbers. My Goodreads challenge for the year was 30 books, and as you can see, I read 47, so I definitely succeeded there. I read a lot more than I thought I was going to. However, I will say that I read quite a lot of short stories and plays this year, and so that number is not all novels, but I'll get to that later. And you can see that reflected in the amount of pages I read. That's not, that's not many pages, really. I had 8 rereads this year, which I'm very happy with. I think rereading is important, and the fact that 17% of what I read this year was a reread makes me very happy. And then I thought it would be interesting to count how many books I bought. Now, I've only counted books that I have actually spent money on. I haven't counted books that I've exchanged or books that were gifted to me. In total, there was 21, but as you can see below there, 8 of those were for school. I was forced to buy them, and only 13 I bought of my own free will. So that 13 is a lot less than I thought it was. I felt like I was spending so much money all throughout the year, but I think that was just because I had to buy 8 school books. Next, we have the length of the books that I read. As you can see, my highest number at 12 is the under 100 pages, and that's because, like I said, I read a lot of individual short stories and plays this year, and they all tend to be under 100 pages. The rest doesn't really surprise me. I do tend towards shorter novels around 200, 300 pages, but I am proud that I read 3 books over 700 pages. That actually surprised me. Next is the publication date of the books. This, again, wasn't all too surprising. I will say that I want to read more books in the late 1800s. As you can see, I already read 9 books from that time period this year, but I would like to read more because I did really like them. I'm quite surprised at how many contemporary recent novels I read. I think that number is high because I read quite a few fantasy books this year and they all tend to be more recent releases. Next is the amount of books and the amount of pages I read by month. This is a bit of an intense graph. As you can see, the amount of books is in blue and the axis for that is on the left, and the amount of pages I read is in red and the axis for that is on the right. I wanted to put both of these on one graph so that I could compare them. As you can see, in February I read 6 books, and that's because I started school in February and I started school at a new place, and so I didn't know what the holiday homework had been, and so when I started they were like, here, have 4 books that you have to read immediately. Everyone else has had the holidays, but you have to read them as fast as you can. So I did that, I got through them, but my reading was kind of just hijacked during February, and you can see that in March I only read 1 book because I was just so done with reading. But I bounced back in April, as you can see. This is the highest amount of books that I read at 10, but I will say that 6 of those were short stories. So you can see, comparatively, the page amount is actually quite low. I mean, it's not a bad amount of pages to have read. It's just quite low compared to the amount of books. And you can see in August, I only read 2 books, but the page count is actually really high. It's at almost 1,500 pages, and the reason for that is because the 2 books I read were 2 gigantic Mistborn novels at over 700 pages each. And then in September, you can see I read exactly 0 books. The reason for that is because I had a lot going on. A friend of mine passed away in late August, so I was grieving. I also had to go into the hospital for a week in September. I was also, because of all of that going on, I was failing school. I was missing so much school and my teachers were pressuring me to come back and finish all this work and catch up on all this work, and I was just really stressed out and my life was just in a bit of shambles in September, and you can see that reflected in my reading. And then in November, you can see I had a fantastic reading month. I read 7 books, only 1 of which was a short story, and you can see that in the pages. I had a huge amount of pages that month. The reason for that is because my dropping out of school was finalized, and so I had all the time in the world. I had nothing to do all day, so I just read, and you can see I had my best reading month of the year. And then December is also quite a good month, but obviously I had a bit more on with the holidays and I had things to go to, but it was still a pretty decent month. I really liked seeing this graph because throughout the year I always feel like I'm sort of staggering through my reading. You know, one month I'll read 5 books and the next I'll read 1 or 2, and it's nice to see that represented in a graph. Next I have my book ratings. Overall, this is what I expected. I knew that 4 stars would be the highest. I am surprised by the amount of 5 stars I have. I do think I became a bit more lenient with, you know, giving out 5 stars this year, but I was also just reading really good books. I also only have 1 book at 1 star, which doesn't surprise me at all. That's not because I didn't read things that I didn't like, it's because I didn't finish them. I don't finish books that I'm not enjoying, and there were so many books this year that I picked up and I was just like, ugh, I'm not enjoying this at all, and so I just don't finish them, and I don't rate things that I don't finish. So I feel like this graph is almost incomplete because it doesn't show the books that I didn't finish. Next I have the author gender percentages. This makes me sad. I knew that males would be, you know, the majority, but I didn't realize it would be quite this much. I will say, for accuracy purposes, that I counted every book that I read, so the same authors are in here twice or more depending on how many books of theirs I read. And I did that because I thought, well, if I read 3 books by J.K. Rowling, I've still read 3 books by a female author. For me, that counts as 3 rather than 1, but I just thought I'd mention that. I definitely want to improve on this percentage next year. Next, I have the author's nationality. Now, for accuracy, I did the author's birthplace just because I didn't know for sure where an author was living or what their citizen status was like, so I just went with the birthplace because that was the easiest to find online. I wanted to make this pie chart because I knew what it would look like. I knew that the US and the UK would be the bulk, and it makes me really, really sad. This is probably the thing that I'm most disappointed on. There has been this gigantic discussion on BookTube about diversity and reading authors of colour, which I think is so, so important, and I am at fault in that area myself with my reading. But another part of that, I think, is reading from different countries. I feel like I'm in this US, UK publishing bubble and I really don't like it. I mean, I'm an Australian and I only read 1 Australian author this year, and I probably only read maybe 20 or 30 Australian authors in my lifetime. That makes me really, really sad, and I really want to change it. This is something that I'm really going to be focusing on next year. Next is genre. This doesn't surprise me at all. I knew that the classics and the fantasy would be the highest. I will say that the classics percentage is inflated with the short stories and the plays that I read. I actually only read 4 classic novels this year, but the short stories and the plays I read were all classics, so that bumped up that score quite a bit. Next year's probably going to look very similar. These are my 3 favourite genres. I think I want to read more general historical works though. Here's the type of book I read. I keep mentioning that I read a lot of short stories and plays, and you can see it represented here. Of course, the novel is still the majority, but I read 7 plays and 7 individual short stories and 4 short story collections and 1 poetry book. So this makes me really happy. I don't want to lose this. If anything, I want to read more plays next year. And lastly, I have my top 5 books of 2014. At number 5, I have Mistborn: The Final Empire by Brandon Sanderson. As much as I didn't love how the trilogy ended, I really did enjoy this first book. It was fantastic from beginning to end. At number 4, I have The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime. This one was such a surprise. I wish there was more books like this, where there is a main character with a condition and we see how that condition affects every part of their life and who they are without making them into inspirations or dehumanizing them. Because there are millions of people in our world with unchangeable conditions and their stories are just as valid. Despite not having Asperger's as the main character does, this book really resonated with me. At number 3, I have Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. This is one of the most popular books of all time, and I can see why. It's a long one at over 500 pages, but that's part of why it works. I spent so long with this character that I just grew so fond of her. It also can't be denied how well written it is. If I explain the synopsis to you, it might sound quite dull, but it's the writing that makes it all vivid and interesting. It's the writing that makes it stay with you. At number 2, I have Fingersmith by Sarah Waters. I tend not to focus on authors in my reading, but every year it seems I'll read a book that will just make me obsessed with the author, determined to read everything they've written. In 2012, it was Ray Bradbury. In 2013, it was Neil Gaiman. And in 2014, it was Sarah Waters. This was the first novel I read of hers, and it is still my favourite. It had so many twists and turns, but it didn't neglect character development while doing it. And my number 1 is The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. This is a short story, of course a short story is at number 1. I will link it down below because it's in the public domain. I think it would be best if you just experience this one for yourself. It'll take you like 30 minutes to read. I absolutely adore this short story. I read it like 5 times in quick succession when I read it this year. So that's it, those are my stats for this year. Mostly I'm happy, but there are some things I would like to improve upon. I'll be making a reading resolutions video pretty soon specifically about that. So let me know how your reading year has been going on, and thank you for watching.